Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, lend me your hearts for a moment, because what I am about to speak is not merely a story from long ago. It is not just a tale buried beneath dust, decay, and the forgotten pages of 1848 Alabama. No, this is a living reminder, a whisper from the past that still shakes the soul, still challenges the conscience, and still calls every one of us to stand taller in the light of truth and justice. It is the echo of a young woman whose name history never bothered to record, a daughter who grew up believing she was unworthy, a human being pushed into the shadows of what society declared unmarriageable. And yet, within that shadow is a flame, a lesson, a mirror for all who dare to look. I want you to imagine the heaviness of that word, unmarriageable. A word not born from her character, not from her virtue, not from her spirit, but from the cruel judgments of the world around her. A world that measured worthiness by standards twisted by pride, prejudice, and power. A world where a father, carrying the weight of his own fears, his own reputation, his own desperation, looked at his daughter and saw not promise but problem, not destiny but burden. And in the year 1848, in the sweltering fields and broken systems of Alabama, that father made a decision that would carve itself into the memory of time. He gave her away, handed her over, to the biggest enslaved man on his land. This was not an act of love. This was not an act of mercy. This was a moment where humanity bent beneath the weight of its own darkness. And yet, my brothers and sisters, out of that darkness rises the question we must confront today: what does a soul become when the world declares it unworthy? What happens to a human heart when others choose its future? And what does God, in His infinite righteousness, do with people the world tries to discard? I want you to hear me clearly. Every era has its own version of the word, unmarriageable. Every generation has its way of labeling, limiting, and locking people into definitions they did not choose. There are people, maybe even someone sitting in this very room, who knows what it feels like to be dismissed, overlooked, underestimated, or handed off as if your life was a problem someone else needed to solve. There are people who have been told they are too much, or not enough, or not the right shape, not the right color, not the right background, not the right pedigree. And every one of those labels tries to carve itself into the heart like a permanent mark. But let me tell you something. There is no label the world can stamp on a person that can override the identity God has destined for them. Not one, not then, and not now. When that young woman was handed over, she did not step into a story she chose. But God has a way of stepping into stories that humans try to ruin. God has a way of reaching into the very moments where injustice tries to write the final chapter and saying, "No, this story is still mine." And though history may not have written her name, heaven did. Heaven wrote her tears. Heaven wrote her prayers. Heaven wrote the tremble in her voice and the strength in her silence. Heaven wrote the truth that even when people misuse power, God is still the author, still the redeemer, still the one who lifts the lowly and shames the proud. And let us not forget the man she was given to, enslaved, stripped of dignity by the world, yet carrying a humanity and a heart the world refused to see. They called him the biggest slave, as if size defined him, as if his body was the only thing they noticed, as if he existed only for labor and obedience. But inside that man was breath, God's breath. Inside him was a soul crafted in the same divine image as the Father who owned him. And in the brokenness of that moment, two lives, both crushed by a system built on domination, found themselves thrown into a future neither asked for. This is not simply a story about oppression. It is a story about the collision between human cruelty and divine purpose. It is a story about what happens when a society believes it can rank the worth of human beings. It is a story about what happens when the people with the least power end up holding the greatest strength. It is a story about God taking what is meant for shame and turning it into testimony. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the silence of that night, the silence of a daughter who wondered why she was not worthy of a husband, why her father saw her as a transaction instead of a treasure. You can hear the silence of a man who had no freedom even over his own life, now forced to accept someone else's daughter into a life he didn't choose. You can hear the weight of two souls pressed into circumstances neither deserved. But silence is not the end. For God does not leave His children unheard. My friends, this introduction is not meant to shock you, but to wake you. Wake you to the truth that every human being, no matter their past, no matter their label, no matter what the world has done to them, carries a divine purpose that cannot be erased. The world can call someone unmarriageable, but God calls them beloved. The world can give someone away, but God can take them back into His hands. The world can attempt to write a script of shame, but God can write redemption across the same page. When I look at this story, I see more than tragedy. I see reflection. I see the way society still tries to measure worth. I see the way people still hand off their responsibilities, their relationships, their children, their commitments because they feel overwhelmed by expectations. I see the way judgment still pushes people aside. And I see the way God still calls the rejected, still lifts the broken, still rebuilds the crushed, still restores the forgotten. There are people today who walk around believing they are too damaged, too flawed, too complicated, too unwanted. People who carry the scars of being treated like burdens instead of blessings. People who have been defined by someone else's decision instead of their own destiny. But let this story remind you, God sees value where people see inconvenience. God sees purpose where people see problems. God sees souls where people see stereotypes. And to anyone listening who has ever felt unwanted, unheard, unseen, or unworthy, hear me now. You are not what they called you. You are not what they chose for you. You are not the decision someone else made over your life. You are God's creation, God's workmanship, God's beloved child. They may have written one chapter, but God holds the pen for the rest. When we revisit 1848 Alabama, we are not just revisiting history. We are revisiting the age-old struggle between human injustice and divine justice, between human labels and divine identity. And as we continue this message, I want you to remember this: the most powerful stories in history were never shaped by the ones holding the whip, the pen, or the law. They were shaped by the ones holding on to their humanity, even when the world tried to strip it away. Tonight, we stand not to glorify the pain of the past, but to learn from it. To draw strength from it. To confront the truth that no person, no matter how the world judges them, falls outside the reach of God's grace. Because the same God who watched over that young woman, the same God who saw the suffering of that enslaved man, is the same God watching over you right now. And He has never lost sight of a single soul. Let us step deeper into this story, not to pity it, not to sensationalize it, but to understand it. Because in understanding it, we understand ourselves. And in understanding ourselves, we begin to understand the heart of God.